Mark chapter 10, I'm going to start reading in verse 46, and it says, "And they came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great number of people, blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the highway side begging. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, 'Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me.' And many charged him that he should hold his peace. But he cried the more a great deal, 'Thou son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. And they called the blind man, saying unto him, 'Be of good comfort, rise, he calleth thee.'" This is not in the message, but just I have to pause here. I find it funny. You have 2 verses earlier, the crowd saying, be quiet, and then be of comfort, he wants you. All of a sudden, their tune changes when Jesus pays attention to this man. But continue on, "Be of good comfort, rise, he calleth thee. And he cast away his garment and rose and came to Jesus. And Jesus answered and said unto him, 'What wilt thou that I should do unto thee?' The blind man said unto him, 'Lord, that I might receive my sight.' And Jesus said unto him, 'Go thy way, thy faith hath made thee whole.' And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus in the way." Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. You can go ahead and be seated. I'll give this slight disclaimer right off the bat. We're doing a series on go. The passage has the word go in it. Verse 52, Jesus said unto him, "Go thy way, thy faith hath made thee whole." And that is quite possibly the only time you're going to hear me say go in the message. So it was in the passage, but that is not the direction the message is going. With this passage, though, we see something that we've seen many times in reading our Bibles, many times in this series already. As Jesus traveling along, people have, by this point, people have seen what Jesus is doing. And because of it, there are crowds that are following him. And for different reasons. Some are following Jesus to hear what he has to say. You know, repeatedly in the Gospels, we read how Jesus taught, and the Bible tells us that they were amazed at his doctrine and amazed at the authority that he spoke with. And because of that, there are undoubtedly people in the crowds that followed Jesus who followed or gathered to hear him because either they had heard him speak before and were amazed and wanted to hear more, or perhaps they had heard about him and wanted to hear from him for themselves. You know, that sort of thing isn't uncommon even still. If people hear that someone is nearby that either they've heard and enjoy listening to, or maybe someone has told them good things about him, you know, they'll travel to hear it. Some follow Jesus to hear what he would say. Some follow Jesus to attempt to twist what he would say. There are no 2 ways around it. The ministry of Jesus was controversial, to say the least. The entire time throughout his ministry, we saw people who tried to trick him, or some who would try to question what he had to say, some who had questioned what he had done, others who tried to twist his words. Some would have been following for that reason, to see if there'd be something that he would say or something that he would do that they could use against him. Some followed perhaps to see what he would do next. You know, when you've built a reputation as being one that not only amazes people with your words, but performs miracles also, you're going to have some who are just going to be looky-loos. Now, they're going to be following just to watch what this guy might do next. You have to remember, by this time, Jesus had already turned the water into wine, cast out unclean spirits. He had healed people of incurable diseases. He had made lame men walk and fed 5,000 plus people. He's built a reputation by this point. People have heard about him and are going to want to see, you know, maybe what he'll do next. And you start doing things like that, and undoubtedly people are going to be following just to watch and see what might happen. In studying for this, I was reminded of a man, so I did a little research about it. The man's name was Robert Knievel. A name you know. He was, though, an unknown name. No one had heard of Robert Knievel, and I didn't know the backstory until I read it while studying for this. I thought it was interesting. no one had heard of Robert Knievel except for the local police, who by age 18 had arrested Robert multiple times for reckless driving. Big shock on that one. It was in fact one of his arresting officers after a high-speed chase who encouraged him to begin doing stunt jumps because of a jump he did in attempting to get away from the police. It was from that. It was that same officer who gave him the nickname Evel Knievel. At that time, or as time went on, Evel Knievel became a household name, even though his last jump was 1975. I said the name tonight, and most everyone in here knew it. His following was huge, literally worldwide. Again, looking at the different jumps he did, they were in London, and he did jumps all over the place. He had gone from an obscure criminal that no one knew about except for the arresting officers to a worldwide icon. All because people wanted to see what he would do next. That's what it was. Well, he's jumped this. What will he do the next time? With Jesus, it would have been no different. Everywhere he went, people had it figured out. Everywhere this guy goes, something big happens. Everywhere this guy goes, there's people healed, or there's, something major that happens. There would have been some people who would have followed just because, they hoped they might get to see one of those things. But then there would have been some who followed hoping for a miracle. That's the position we find Bartimaeus in. You have some infirmity. Maybe it's a disease that you've tried everything to do, or everything you know to do, and nothing is working. I think of the lady with the issue of blood that the Bible tells us about, who had spent all that she had on doctors, but to no avail. Or for others that were born lame, that they've spent their entire lives having to beg for help, relying on others to take them from place to place. We don't think much about just getting up and walking where we want to go, but for some that isn't easy. Begging money for food because they can't work. For others it was leprosy or other health issues, but they followed Jesus, hoping that perhaps his next big miracle would be on them, that they would be the one that was healed. Again, that's where we find blind Bartimaeus, a man who is known. How the Bible names him is blind Bartimaeus. That's on purpose. He is known for the fact that he's a blind man. He hears that Jesus is coming by, and he knows, I might be that next one. Maybe if he just hears me. So as we read, he cries out, and the crowd tries to quiet him, and he just keeps it up. And who can blame him? This may be your only chance. Not maybe, this is your only chance. Not like he had a whole list of options if Jesus didn't stop. Jesus hears him and heals him. But then Jesus takes just a brief moment, and he gives one phrase right before he heals him, or as he heals him, in which we can learn a lot. He says, "Thy faith hath made thee whole." Thy faith hath made thee whole. Which I found interesting. Not I've made thee whole, not my Father's made thee whole, not the miracle I'm about to do, not my ability, not my power, my Father's power. All those things could have healed him, but Jesus says, your faith hath made thee whole. So as I was studying for this, based off of that, I have three questions that I want to address this evening. The first is, what is your faith in? Your faith for Bartimaeus, his faith making him whole, it was awfully important what his faith was based in. What are you trusting in? We trust in things all the time. Most of the time, without even realizing that that's what we're doing. This morning, you trusted that your alarm clock would wake you up. You set it last night, knowing that it would do its job and it would make a bunch of annoying noise and would finally get you out of bed. You trusted your alarm clock. You trusted that your lights would turn on when you flip the switch. Most likely you don't understand how electricity works and how exactly it runs through the wires and does all that, but you trusted when I hit that switch, it's going to come on. You went to work and trusted that if you worked an 8-hour day, your boss would pay you for an 8-hour day. It's not like, the day starts and your boss shows you a handful of bills and says, this is what you get when you work your day. You just trust that he has it. You trust that when Friday comes, there's going to be a paycheck. You trusted your car would start when you turn the key, even though, again, most people don't have any idea how their car works. They trust it will start and it'll get them from one place to another, and more so, you trusted that your driving skills to navigate all the crazy drivers. You came to church trusting the doors would be unlocked, the specials would be ready, and that I would be prepared to preach. You walked in here this evening and you sat on a chair trusting it would hold you. I was watching because I knew this was in here. I didn't see anyone walk in here and climb on the floor before they sat down to double check their chair and make sure it looked sturdy. Nobody did that. No one made sure that their chair was actually going to hold them. You walked in and you sat down. You trusted the chair. We trust in things all the time without ever really even putting a thought into it, but maybe we should put a little more thought into it. What is your faith in? Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, a familiar passage says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not into thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Trust in the Lord. It's pretty specific where your faith, where your trust needs to be pointed. It's not at your understanding. It's not in your ways. It's in his. What's your faith and your trust in? What's your faith and your trust in for eternity? I know that this is a Wednesday night crowd, but what are you trusting in for eternity? There are a lot of people who come to church whose faith is not in the right place. Maybe it's in their church attendance. If they go to church enough, it might appease God to allow them into heaven. I worked with a guy who was very much that way. He was very, very faithful to his church, and I'm purposely not saying where, but was very, very faithful to his church. And I just, there are sometimes you just get a weird feeling from people you work with about those sorts of things. So I just asked him, I said, have you ever accepted Christ as your Savior? And his response, very honest, was, well, no, but I'm sure if I go here often enough, God will be okay with it. It's where his trust was. He went to a church that I know the church, that's not what they preach, but that's where his trust was. Trust was in church attendance, or maybe it's in the good things that they're doing, but their trust is misguided. Have you ever trusted in something and thought that you could trust it and it turned out you couldn't? And we've all had experiences like that. I used the example of a chair earlier. Have you ever sat in a chair assuming this chair will hold me, and then you sit down and it doesn't hold you? My wife and I had these dining room chairs, and I was sitting in one of them a few years back now, and my wife thought that she would sit on my lap, and neither of us thought anything of it. It's a chair, of course it's going to hold. And it did, but the chair back didn't. She sat down and I leaned back, and the back of the chair snapped off. We had trusted in something that, simply put, just wasn't trustworthy. We thought it was. We thought that we could rely on it. We thought that we could trust it, but we couldn't. And that's what's happening when someone trusts in the wrong things for their eternity. It may seem okay. It's just not trustworthy. What's your faith in? What's your trust in for your eternity? What's your faith in for the day-to-day? As Christians, this is a place where we really struggle. And I say we on purpose. If you're saved, you've already understood that you have to trust God for your eternity, but all those day-to-day things prove to be extremely challenging for us. Those day-to-day things, those problems that come up, those decisions that have to be made, we tend to, rather than relying on God, rely on ourselves. Rely on men, on our ability. completely disregarding Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. There's a major flaw with that plan, though. Our ability, man's ability, is limited. Our ability is a whole lot like that chair, that it looks like it'll hold, but it'll break every time. Your ability may seem okay, but it's not. What's your faith in? Is it in men or is it in God? The second question this evening is what has your faith done for you? We started in Mark 10 and we've seen blind Bartimaeus and his faith did something. Just makes it clear, thy faith hath made thee whole. His faith did something. When you're known as blind Bartimaeus and now you can see, maybe I'm just a little too simple here, but your faith just made a big difference when you go from blind Bartimaeus to seeing Bartimaeus. Your faith just made a big difference. Every aspect of this man's life just changed. He's no longer has to rely on others to help him get from place to place. He no longer has to beg on the street corner because he can actually see to earn his own living. And just an added bonus to this, the very first thing that he got to lay his eyes on was Jesus. The guy's life has changed that day because of his faith, but that makes me think, what has your faith done for you? Has it made a change? It should make a change in you. It should make a change in our faith. It ought to make a change in us spiritually. Your faith in God should change your spirit. By that, I'm just going to put it this way, your attitude. Those of you who know me know I tend to be, I know this is kind of my personality anyways, but I tend to be kind of a glass half full kind of guy. Pastor was talking about the skydiving Sunday, and I'm kind of one of those, what's the worst that can happen? It can't be that bad. I'm a glass half full. I don't know that I would say I'm happy-go-lucky, but I'm close. I'm pretty upbeat most of the time, and I know that not everyone is that way, and I'm sure that someone will disagree with me here, but I don't really believe a Christian has the right to be anything but happy. I know we all go through difficult things, and myself as well. We all go through things that test us, and things that are difficult, and things that, on first reaction it tends to get us down. But when you start to think about all of the things that God has done for us, whether it be your salvation, or the many ways that He's provided for us, or the fact that He hears and answers our prayer, or the fact that He's coming again for you, or on and on and on we can go, how could we possibly be anything but in a good attitude, and it not be simply being ungrateful for what God's done? Now, a Christian being in a bad attitude would be no different than if I made my kids their favorite meal and sit them down and they sit down and do nothing but complain about it. I say my wife makes them their favorite meal, because I probably can't cook whatever their favorite meal is. I don't even know what it is. I bet you she does. It would be as if my wife made my kids their favorite meal and they sit down and did nothing but complain. A Christian having the wrong attitude is no different. As a parent, that'd have you pretty upset if you went to all that work and then your kids sit down and complain about it. But often that's what we do to God. Our faith in God, our trust that He has and will continue to provide for us should cause a change in our spirit. Our faith should cause a physical change. Our faith in God ought to change the things that we do. I know I've said it many times in here, but I was saved at a young age. When you're saved at 4, it's not like you're living in a whole lot of sin. But I know without a question that my faith changed me from what I would have been. I've been, at this point, a plumber for 12 years and in construction since I was 14. I know where I could have been had it not been for my faith and the change it had in my life. That ought to be true in us. That we aren't the same as we used to be. That we aren't the same as the unsaved. Faith makes a spiritual change. It makes a physical change Our faith makes an eternal change. I think it's pretty obvious, and it doesn't need tons of explanation, but when your faith is in God rather than in men, instead of a future that is eternity in hell, where you'll be in fire and torments from eternity with no escape, no reprieve, no help, you've traded that eternity for eternity on streets of gold, walls of jasper, crystal-flowing rivers, gates of pearl, mansions, and don't forget, sitting at the feet of Jesus, worshiping the one who created everything, throwing your crowns at the feet of the one who died for you. Maybe I'm simple. That's a big change. I'm not trying to oversimplify this a little bit, but going from eternal fire and torments to eternally in a perfect place, that's a bit of a change. So far, we've asked the question, what's your faith in? What has your faith done for you? And then lastly tonight, last question this evening, what has your faith done for others? What has your faith done for others? Bartimaeus, known in this passage as blind Bartimaeus, was forever changed and was changed in a way that he wasn't the only one who noticed the change. Others would have seen it. Again, if your name is blind Bartimaeus, people are going to notice he sees things now. And when they notice, that's going to cause someone to be curious about what happened to you. How did you go, how did a man who is known for being blind change to a man who can see and is following Jesus? And everyone who asks gets to hear about what Jesus did in his life. They all get to hear about the change that was made in his life because of his faith. Bartimaeus' life became a testimony. So now this change that Jesus made on his life had a chance to change the life of others. Think of it this way. For another blind man, and you hear that Bartimaeus, who was once blind, met Jesus and now can see, wouldn't you want to talk to Bartimaeus and figure out what he did? Wouldn't you want to hear what worked for him? Wouldn't you want to know what his trick was, what that gave him his sight back, so that the same change might happen in you? Or hearing of the change in Bartimaeus might cause a crippled man to say, I want to see what happened in this guy's life so that maybe this same man can help me too. The change in his life caused by his faith would have made a change in others as well. It would have changed life for those who were used to seeing him. The passage that we start in it mentions, and I didn't write down exactly where it was, that he sat by the highway side begging. It's a common thing for those days for beggars, that they sat in the same place every day. Those who passed him every single day would have been used to seeing, there's blind Bartimaeus' spot. But now, I can see someone walking by saying, where'd Bartimaeus go? I haven't seen him here for a couple of days. Well, what happened to that blind man? Causes a change. What about the change for those who used to help him? His family and his friends, those who he relied on before to help him with the basic day-to-day tasks, and now no more. His faith made a change not only in him, but changed life for others as well. What has your faith, or what is your faith doing for others? Is the difference obvious enough in your life that it causes people to see? Change in Bartimaeus' life was obvious. Is the difference in our life enough that it causes people to see, or can they see no difference? I mentioned when I was 17, I tried. I didn't try real hard. I basically just didn't say that I was a Christian. But it didn't take but a week of me working there before I had guys saying, what's different about you? Why don't you talk like we do? Why don't you go out like we do? Why don't you? and I'm not trying to brag on myself by any means in this at all, but the reason is there was a difference that can be seen. Is that how our life is? You know, the name Christian means Christ-like. When people look at you, it's a real simple question. Do they see Christ? They ought to. If we're doing what we need or what we should be. Bartimaeus' faith, his faith was in Jesus. It made a change in his life, and it affected those around him. And as I studied this, it brought my mind to this question: what's my faith doing? In closing, let me kind of propose this thought, and then I'll wrap up the message. If your faith is not life-changing faith, then it's probably faith placed in the wrong place. Bartimaeus' faith didn't work because of him. His faith wasn't in man. His faith wasn't in himself or doctors or anything like that. His faith was in Jesus, and that's why it made a change. If our faith is in God, it will make a difference. So if your faith isn't making a change in your life and in others, it ought to cause us to ask the question, where does my faith lie? It ought to cause us to examine ourselves and see, am I really trusting God or am I trusting me? So tonight, what's your faith doing? Let's pray.